Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Social Studies Online from the Smithsonian. My name is Abby Fischer. I'm an education specialist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and I'm with my colleagues today to talk about this really interesting question: do technological advances change history? And before I toss it over to them, just wanted to talk a little bit about how we encourage and invite you to join in this conversation today. So in your YouTube screen, you'll be able to see that you can post comments, and we encourage you to use this to ask us questions as we go throughout today's webcast. Please, though, don't post any private information. And if you are a parent or a teacher watching with your student, we encourage you to participate actively. Now, one other thing to mention, the live webcast you're watching right now will be archived afterwards at the same YouTube URL. And so we encourage you to come back, re-listen, share this with friends, and participate all over again. So with that, I'll hand it over to Orlando.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Abby, for our introduction for the day and introducing our question. And before we do get started with some of the thoughts around that question for today, I'd like to introduce our guest who is joining us today, Abir Saha. He is also with us at the National Museum of American History, and he is a curator there. My name is Orlando Serrano. I am the manager for youth and teacher programs. So a lot of the work I do is, going through, collections that we have, exhibits that we have, and working with Abby and our other coworker Eden to provide resources for teachers and students to use in the classroom. And today, Abir is going to be in conversation with us about this question so that we can think about how technology does or does not impact and change history in different ways. Abir, could you please introduce yourself to the folks joining us today, either live or after the fact in the archive view? Tell us a little bit about what you do at the museum, what your role is there, and how you ended up at American History.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Orlando. So I am the curator of engineering and the Merrill Family Secretarial Scholar at the National Museum of American History. I'm in the Work and Industry Division. So as a curator, I collect historical artifacts. I help create exhibitions, both digital and on the museum floor. And I also do a lot of research on the history of technology. On a day-to-day basis, it's either researching an object in our collections or one that I'm trying to acquire for the museum. I also write and publish for larger audiences. And right now I'm working on writing a history of the origin of feedlots in the 20th century US. I have been getting my PhD at the University of Virginia, and I learned that the Smithsonian was seeking a curator of engineering, someone with both historical expertise as well as an engineering background, and I had to apply, and so I'm here.
Excellent, excellent. And how long have you been with American History?
So I've joined at a very interesting time. I started this January, so not very long, but loving it so far and loving Washington, D.C.
Wonderful. Now we know that you're finishing up your dissertation, and that's a process and a project in and of itself. Are you able to jump on and take on some projects right now at the museum? Are there any research interests or projects or exhibits that you're working on that you'd like to share with the folks today?
Sure. I've been able to split my time fairly well between my dissertation work and sort of the needs of the job. I have been working to understand the mechanical and civil engineering collections, which are thousands of objects that have been at this museum for some time. And I think one of the things I'm most looking forward to working on is an exhibition on technology and agriculture in the US. And so I can't really give too many more details about it. It's still in the work. But yeah, that's something I'm excited to be working on.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, we are going to get started with our collection today that you put together with several cultural resources from our collection in American History. And before we actually start working with this one and talking about this one, could you please say a little bit about how you went about putting this collection together today? This is sort of like behind the scenes, like how a curator thinks and works. how did you cull through the collections to put this together for us to talk about today? What's the through line that you see?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question, Orlando. So I tried to pick out both everyday technologies as well as big sort of transformational technologies as well as technological systems. And what I'm trying to show here is that when we hear about technologies that have shaped history, sometimes what we miss are the conscious agents behind that change. So as historians, we have to insist that humans shape history, not technologies alone. Technologies are a product of human initiative, but sometimes in the stories that we tell, we kind of grant them a power of their own. But as historians, we like to think that technologies are subject to the context of the time. They're embedded in our very human practices and routines. They're not somehow an independent domain, developed in isolation, but actually they're deeply embedded in our culture. Yeah, so that's the frame for our collection today. What we'll learn is how some of the technologies we take for granted could have been so different. That their role in history of technology is not somehow predetermined or inevitable, but it's highly contingent, which is a word historians use that means it's highly dependent on something else.
Yeah, and thank you very much for letting us hear your thinking around these objects. And to highlight a few of the remarks that you made, I want to make sure I want to check for my own understanding as an educator. It's something I ask with students, and today I'm a student, so I want to make sure I get what you're saying. We're going to look at everyday objects, some larger scale objects, as well as some technological systems, and to really think about the humans involved in the creation of technologies, to think about how these technological innovations and advances came to be at a particular moment in time. Like what were the surrounding needs that were that these advances? Okay. Okay. Very cool. All right. So let's start here. We are beginning with the cotton gin. What are some misconceptions that folks may have about the cotton gin, and why are we starting here today?
Right. So we're starting with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and this object has a place in practically every U.S. history textbook, or at some point in their sort of middle school, high school career. A student will come across this object, and the story goes that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1794 at a time when slaves were removing cotton seeds out of cotton balls by hand. It was a slow process. It wasn't very profitable. But with Whitney's gin, as in Whitney's own words, he said, 2 could do the work of 100. So plantation owners in the story, they sort of adopted Whitney's gin overnight and began producing large cotton crops. And in effect, the story often goes that the cotton gin led to the expansion of slavery and eventually led to the American Civil War. Now, those are some really big claims, and this familiar story is actually flawed in some really surprising and crucial ways. So first off, Eli Whitney was not the first to invent the cotton gin at all. Cotton gins have been around since the 5th century, so literally thousands of years. And some of these older gins, they used rollers to accomplish this task of removing the seed from the cotton ball. Improvements were made in places as far-reaching as India and the Caribbean. But what Whitney did was he invented a different type of gin. So instead of the rollers that previous gins used, Whitney was able to use these coarse wire teeth that kind of pulled the cotton off of the seed. Exactly. So
okay.
Whitney, and another misconception is that the gin wasn't immediately adopted, even though Whitney's gin kind of processed more cotton with less labor than past gins. It produced this kind of tangled and low quality fiber, and so this prompted a lot of Southerners like Hodgin Holmes to replace the wire teeth with circular saw blades, which frankly did a better job. But here's the crucial bit. Whitney and his associate Miller actually sued people like Holmes took them to court and successfully argued that these improvements were based on Whitney's original patent. And by winning these cases, essentially Whitney was immortalized as the inventor of the cotton gin. Even though roller gins did not disappear overnight, they continued to be used. Both Black and white Southerners continued to sort of improve upon these different designs of the gin over the course of the 19th century. And one more thing. Is it okay if I say one more thing?
Sure. No, go for it.
The most problematic claim around the cotton gin is the one I had mentioned earlier, which is that it led to the expansion of slavery and thus the Civil War. The problem with this is slaves were first brought to continental North America in like 1619, 1620. And by 1790, which is 4 years before Whitney's cotton gin came into the picture, over 20% of the population of the United States was enslaved. So the point being that the South was already invested in the institution of slavery when the cotton gin entered into the context. And there were other factors that also helped in the expansion of slavery. It was, for instance, the increased demand from England, because in England they developed mechanized cotton spinning, so they wanted more of the raw material. And finally, about the Civil War, slavery has been a contentious issue since the time of the American Revolution, well before the cotton gin. So there's no simple way in which the cotton gin, made the Civil War inevitable. So I guess what I'm saying is the cotton gin cannot be given so much explanatory power to sort of obscure other factors. If we look around us today, America is kind of clearly haunted by its painful history of slavery and racism. And in order to understand this situation, we need to have a clearer perspective on this traumatic past. And part of doing that is to acknowledge that slavery wasn't the doing of a machine. It was the doing of a white America kind of convinced of its racial superiority and invested in a particular form of capitalism. And the form of capitalism was built on the stolen labor of enslaved people. So I know I've said a lot on the cotton gin, but I felt like that was really important.
It is very important. And, I want to highlight, some of like an undertone of what your explanation about the cotton gin is, and takes us back to what you were thinking about when you put this collection together, is that we cannot give technology more credit, good or bad, than we give humans. And the role of human agency and the role of human decisions and desires, in this case, more cotton, with or without the cotton gin, that desire was going to be there and it would have been met another way.
Yes.
So, okay. All right. Well, let's move on to our second resource here. And we've got here an image. We have an image of an early electric automobile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This was fascinating to me because we all know Priuses, we all know Teslas, and even the documentary that was out a few years ago, Who Killed the Electric Car, makes it seem as though the electric car was a recent idea. But this is an image from 1897. Exactly. So what can you tell us about this car, and why is it that we think that the electric vehicle is a relatively new idea?
Great questions, Orlando. So this is the Columbia Electric Horseless Carriage. That's what a lot of them were called back in the late 19th century. It was the first automobile actually to be offered as a stock model, which is what we see at car dealerships around the country today, rather than sort of a custom order or a made-to-order vehicle. And believe it or not, it sort of led the nation in automobile sales from 1897 to around 1900. So electric vehicles at that time were actually more popular at this sort of dawn of automobility in America than its alternatives, which were steam and gasoline. And to your question about why we think it's a new idea, we tend to imagine, you're right, we tend to imagine electric vehicles as cars of the future, if not the need of the present, as scientists are drawing our attention to the problems of climate change and the urgency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and whatnot. But just because we see our current landscape dominated by gasoline engines doesn't mean, as this image and object says, doesn't mean that it was always this way. I think in 1899, when there were only just 2,500 automobiles in the US, most of them were steam and electric, and each had its advantages. Electric vehicles were cleaner, quieter, reliable, simple to operate, but they only had like a 25-mile range. They were time-consuming to recharge, and they also didn't handle hills and rough roads very well. Whereas steam, which kind of took over from electric vehicles around 1900 for a few years, they were really good. Steam engines were really good hill climbers. They were powerful. They wouldn't stall very easily. They were able to carry a lot of weight, and they weren't very expensive. But they also had disadvantages, like they were slow to build up speed. They needed fresh water every 20, 30 miles, and sometimes they even required special training. But it was only in sort of 1903 and onwards that gasoline engines and gasoline automobiles began to take the lead in the industry, with cars such as the Oldsmobile. And the reason for this is gasoline engines were more versatile. They were somewhere between electric and steam as far as cost and ease of use, but they were able to do the job of both. You know, they could climb ordinary hills, drive through snow, mud, sand, but they also had disadvantages, right? Like our other alternatives. They were noisy, they were smelly, prone to vibrations, difficult to start, they stalled easily, so on and so forth. So the picture I'm trying to paint is that in the late 1800s, even the early 1900s, America just wasn't sure on the best type of engine. And this only became clear when the sort of private ownership of automobiles sort of started expanding in the sort of pleasure market. So meaning that gasoline engines triumphed because elites who were able to afford these vehicles were seeking recreational uses. You know, they were seeking cars with which to move out of the cities and explore the American countryside. And that became a large market. And because they were sort of easier than steam to operate and could go farther than electric cars, they kind of emerged. But actually, probably the most important factor in the emergence of gasoline vehicles was the poor state of American roads. The other vehicles just simply couldn't compete with gasoline in that area. So my point is that even though the gasoline engines couldn't match the sort of quiet elegance of electrics or the sheer power of steam, they did the job of both in the city as well as outside the city.
Okay. So if we would have had better roads in the 1800s, the electric car might have been developed a little bit more. Is that a fair question to ask?
It could well have been. So interesting. Yeah, the point is, gasoline engines weren't somehow just this dramatically superior technology. But once they did sort of take hold, they became established and entrenched, leading to a lot of investment in petroleum and oil and gas, drilling, extraction, a network of distribution, gas stations all around the country. And once that happened, what historians call, technological momentum, it became very difficult to replace. And that's why electric vehicles have sort of struggled since in their comebacks.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm taking notes because, like I said, I am a student today. All right, so let's move on to our next resource, which is a refrigerated car model. And, it is interesting to know and think about that these have been around for over 150 years, right? The question is, how were refrigerator car models developed and how did they change history? What impact did they have?
Yeah. So the refrigerated car is sort of the story of a new technology overcoming an older, entrenched one. So of a story of overcoming technological momentum in one sense, because refrigerated rail cars specifically replaced what were known as stock cars or cattle cars, which carried live animals on the railroads. To get a good sense of this, you have to realize that before refrigerated rail cars, animals like cows were slaughtered close to places of consumption. So every city has its own slaughterhouses. Every neighborhood had practically its own butchers, which is very different from our situation today. Live animals back then were shipped in these special stock cars from Midwestern cities like Chicago to the East Coast and then slaughtered locally, close to those consumers. It was also a seasonal industry. You know, some cured meats were shipped, but only during the winter months when temperatures were low to preserve the meat, because in the summer they would just rot. So it's very different from our current moment where we have a highly concentrated meat industry with relatively few plants supplying the entire nation. You might have seen some of this come up in the news lately. But the refrigerated rail car helped create this situation, this current modern situation. With its introduction, packers essentially could process these live animals at large centralized slaughterhouses, such as at the Union Stockyards in Chicago, and they were able to do it all year long and then ship the final product to cities and towns. And this obviously created a lot of savings and efficiencies for the meat packers. They didn't have to pay for shipping the full weight of the animal, for instance, right? Because more than half of an animal is not edible and would go to waste at these smaller slaughterhouses. But with these bigger centralized ones, packers were able to find uses for some of those inedible parts. And it was actually Gustavus Swift, who was the founder of one of the major meatpacking companies of the 19th and early 20th century, who realized that this rail journey of live animals actually led to them losing a lot of weight, and they had to be fed and watered. It was all expensive. So he started looking for alternatives. And it was with the help of an engineer, Andrew Chase, that he was able to build the first really effective insulated refrigerated car, an example of which we see in this image. And it had ice racks on top and carcasses packed into the space below, and the cold ice down, and it kept the meat from spoiling. But this adoption, it wasn't automatic. Very much like the cotton gin, right? It wasn't immediate or somehow universal. The railroads, American railroads, were really invested in shipping live animals. That's where the technological momentum comes in, right? And refrigerated cars would make their investment redundant, right? So, and they'd be shipping less weight. So the gains essentially that the packers got from reducing the freight would become the loss of the railroad. And the way Gustavus Swift was able to sort of bypass this resistance of American railroads was by approaching a Canadian railroad that went from Chicago to New York via Canada, a Canadian Grand Trunk. Because the Canadian railroad didn't have as much livestock or any livestock business, and therefore it had nothing to lose from refrigerated rail cars. But build a whole system around these refrigerated rail cars. He had to get the ice, he had to create distribution centers. The point being that it was an entire system of technologies and businesses that made refrigerated rail cars effective and ultimately transformational.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate again, giving us the context that these technologies did not just appear, but again, folks are trying to figure out, how do I, in this case, gain more profit and not have to pay for shipping heavy animals? What are the things that I can do on my end to control the production chain? Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna pause here, see if Abby has any questions for us before we wind down with our last 10 minutes together and get to 3 more cultural resources. Abby, do we have any questions that we could answer?
We do. So I'll read it, but I'll put it on the screen as well. So the question, would you say that the improved cotton gin made cotton plantations more profitable, therefore cementing plantation owners' perceived dependence on enslaved labor? So going back to our first resource that we discussed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So historians actually have gone back and forth about what was really profitable in terms of slavery, whether these plantations were profitable. If the cotton gin certainly helped, but I think I think there's some consensus among historians to state that actually, ultimately, what really was profitable was the slave trade between American states. That was really where a lot of money was being made. So sure, I imagine that the cotton plantations must at least have been slightly profitable to have grown and really become entrenched. But most of the real real profit in this system, in this entire system of slavery, was actually from the trading of humans, of human lives and human bodies, less from the actual work that the slaves did.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Abir. Our next resource that we're going to be looking at is the Altair 8800 microcomputer. And my question to start off is, what is a microcomputer, or why are we calling this a microcomputer? What are we comparing this against that makes it, seem so small that they gave it a micro name, but to me, and the computer that I'm using right now looks giant.
So a microcomputer is basically what we would call a personal computer. It was called micro or mini in certain instances because it was just much, much smaller than most computers in the 1960s and 70s, which at the time were these large mainframes built by IBM.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you want to know more about the Altair itself?
Yes, I did actually. So, I know that we have some information here, but we don't have time to read it all. But what was the Altair, and why, or I guess going back to some of the commentary that you given us earlier, what were the desires, right, that drove the innovation from the large computer processor to these microcomputers, and then whatever happened to Altair?
Right. Yeah, good question. So Intel in 1971 began producing these microprocessors, which really made personal or mini computers possible in the first place. MITS, Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, which built the Altair, was based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, really not very close at all to where Intel and IBM were in Boston and the East Coast at the time. Actually, they were much closer to what eventually became Silicon Valley. Edward Roberts, who was the founder of MITS, when he first built the Altair, he was hoping to break even with maybe selling 200, but within 3 months he had like a backlog of 4,000 orders or something like that. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for the Altair and other personal computers, and this led to like the creation of hobbyist clubs and computer stores and newsletters and magazines in a way that the larger mainframe computers had never been able to generate. To use the Altair, you had to, even though initially it just cost like $400, to really use it, you had to get a terminal and floppy disks, and a printer, and this kind of increased the price a little bit, but still, for around $5,000, you had a machine for the first time that an individual could do things like word processing and file management and running basic programs. So with the creation or invention of the Altair, entrepreneurs like really flocked to the West Coast, to places like Berkeley and Stanford and New Mexico. And Bill Gates and Paul Allen were actually among them. They moved to New Mexico to start a software company in 1975. So not much after the Altair came out. And that company, of course, became Microsoft. And Microsoft, like its first product was a computing language for the Altair called BASIC.
That's fascinating.
The larger point is,
the
technology doesn't develop in like an independent or any kind of linear fashion that's determined just by math and science. Otherwise, Intel, which produced the first microprocessor, would also have been the first to create the personal computer. But it wasn't. because Intel served a very different market than MITS. MITS, before the Altair, had been selling calculators for personal use. So they could sort of conceive of and build personal computers in a way that Intel probably wasn't thinking, because that wasn't their market then.
Okay. Well, we have two more cultural resources to get to. I do want to let folks know that there are supplemental and additional resources that Abir has provided to give us more background information around some of our different items in the collection today. This one here is an article that provides more context for the personal computer. And with that, we will transition to a patent model of a cooking stove. And, you know, we all have stoves, for the most part, cooktops, any sorts of different variations on this. And thinking about this, how did such a mundane, everyday object really impact and change the lives of folks across the country?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, you know, we have to kind of get a sense for 19th century America before the stove oven. Men and women at the time, and children, and they sort of were equally productive members of the household. Women's household work was considered skill labor just as much as men's, and it required years of experience. Not only were women, you know, baking and cooking and cleaning and nursing, but they also helped cultivate fields. They winnowed wheat and rye and milked cows. They made butter. They stitched and sewed. But essentially, they participated in whatever the family trade was. But this was all prior to the Industrial Revolution. These domestic routines and sort of household division of labor between men and women was really quite profoundly changed with the introduction of technologies like the cast iron stove. And since that's a patent model that's not made of cast iron, but most of them were, because you're essentially burning stuff in them. You can't make them out of wood. So just in case you're wondering why the patent model. But the cast iron stove, it became one of the first mass consumer durable products. Prior to stoves, though, it was hearths, like essentially fireplaces, that were used to cook. And these were large, they were expensive, they required special skills to build. So, but when stoves replaced them, and they replaced them because they were cheaper and they were more fuel efficient. They were fuel flexible, so they could use several different kinds of fuels. And when stoves replaced hearths, they crucially reduced the amount of wood that men had to cut, and this freed up men's time because they were doing most of the wood cutting and women weren't. And this allowed men to leave the home to earn cash wages, because they needed the cash now to either purchase coal for the stove oven or to buy new manufactured goods that were entering the market in the early to mid 19th century. And this created this kind of doctrine of separate spheres, where women were responsible for the home and men for the wages, right? This hadn't really been the case prior. This emerged partly because of the switch from stove ovens to from hearths to stove ovens, but also because of this kind of broader context of the emergence of industrial capitalism, where factories were emerging and factories needed laborers, and only men who were freed up from household or farming activities they go out and work there, and women didn't get paid for these household duties, whereas men got paid for their work outside. So women's work came to be not really thought of as labor. So this really changed the home dynamic and the sort of the gender relations in America. Something as innocuous as the stove oven.
I feel like we need to pause here, because this is really interesting, and I think I want to make sure that I understand this. So the folks joining us, watching this, whenever they do, also understand this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Abir. At one point, leaving the home to earn cash wages was a hobby. Eventually, it became more of the norm.
Yeah, there wasn't a need, because most of the food and the produce and whatever the family was producing was all done at home. Yeah,
but as that
revolution changed that with the emergence of factories and such products.
And as that became less of a hobby, women's work was seen more of a hobby when it was in the home because it was not tied to cash wages.
Right. I don't know if I'd use the word hobby. It was
Okay.
hobby in the sense of not really being work. It still was work. That's the
Yeah.
It may have started to be seen as less work, frankly.
Got it.
But you're absolutely right in that this transition really marked a difference in the way men and women were perceived in their gender relations. It's what's called the doctrine of separate spheres. That's part of how it emerged.
All right. One more. This has been a fascinating conversation, Abir. I do want to let folks know that if you want to learn more about domestic technology, we also have another article here. But the last that we will look at today is a feed yard. And I wanted to get to this because it is right in line with the work that you do. And I'm really interested in how we should consider feedlots as a technology and how feedlots have, in fact, changed history.
Right. Thank you. So again, great questions. What I'd like to really bring out is that technology isn't just located in objects, right? Systems and processes can also be technologies. So what are feedlots? They're these highly controlled environments where various, specific technologies such as artificial hormones, antibiotics, engineered animals, genetically modified corn, waste treatment processes, they all sort of come together to form a system that concentrates the feeding and the growth of hundreds of thousands of animals into these small spaces. So the way in which these different technologies come together in this system of the feedlot, that's also a new technology in and of itself. And it's no surprise that often these are called factory farms. And that's where most of the supermarket comes from.
Okay, can you describe, like, very quickly what we're seeing here? I'm fascinated by the green eye that's looking at me.
Yeah. So this is a series. This photograph is from part of a series by Mishka Henner called Feedlots, and it depicts these feedlot sites from satellite technology, like Google Earth. So there's this British artist was actually searching for satellite images of oil fields in the United States when he accidentally stumbled upon these bird's eye images of these flattened feedlots. And he was totally intrigued, especially by, I don't know if you can see it in the image, those on the screen, but there are these black and white dots that are scattered across the landscape. And these are actually cattle. And from a distance, they hardly resemble cattle farms, right? Rather, they resemble this kind of odd, oozing, abstract watercolor painting, especially the lagoon in the center, because that's what it is. It's a manure lagoon. It's filled with essentially animal waste, which is quite toxic in those concentrations, and can lead to water pollution and other kinds of dangers. But I think Henner actually says it really well, and I'm going to quote his words here. We live in a world where the scale of these industries are so vast, we can't see them. We have no way to visualize them. And as long as we can't, we struggle to conceptualize them and to get our heads around it, to understand it better, to understand the scale and consequences. I will, though, put the caveat that these are the lagoon in the center. These are slightly enhanced images that Henner enhanced. Those sort of eerie greens aren't actually so radiant, but the physical detail of the landscape is untouched. He's just kind of brought out the colors a little bit. Okay, and that's why it's art. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Abir, I want to thank you for your time today and for bringing, as you promised at the outset, everyday objects, large-scale objects, and systems for us to think about how technology, how changes, how innovation has moved the arc of history in one way or another. Abby, do we have any questions before we head on out for today?
No, we don't, but I know people have been engaged in the conversation and they're looking at the resources. So Abir, thank you for such a fascinating discussion. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thanks, Abby and Orlando, for organizing this and hosting this.
Yeah, and for folks who are looking for more resources, this is going to be the URL for the Permanent Learning Lab collection. We have also put it in the comments section for those who are seeing this after the fact. And we do want to remind you that we will be back next week for our last Social Studies Online for this season, and it will be how can the past inform our present and future? Lastly, I do want to remind folks that in about 20 minutes, we are going to be doing another Social Studies Online session in Spanish for folks who are English language learners or who are learning Spanish as a second language. Please join Magdalena Mieri, who will be hosting a conversation on the same topic. Thank you very much for being with us, and we will talk later. Thanks, Abir. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Veer.